The arena was loud with laughter and cheers as the crowd filled the seats high above the training floor, and the sun burned bright above the shield dome that protected them from the wild wind outside, and in the middle of the arena stood a tall, alien warrior girl named Vesha, with deep blue skin, silver eyes and arms, wrapped in tribal bands that marked her as one of the strongest fighters of her kind, and she stood with her arms crossed, looking at the human. Across from her, the human was named Cade, and he looked out of place with no armor, no weapons, and only a plain shirt and pants that looked worn and soft like they belonged to a servant, not a fighter, and his hair was messy, his boots old, and his expression was calm, as if none of this mattered to him. Vesha pointed at him with a grin, and shouted loud enough for all to hear, "This is the warrior you send against me. He looks like a meal, not a match," and the crowd laughed with her, and many clapped or whistled as if the fight was already won before it began. Did not speak, he only looked at her, and then at the ground like he was thinking of something far away, and Vesha stepped closer with slow steps, her voice mocking and sharp. "I hope your bones are softer than your face, because I do not like waiting for my victories." The arena guard raised a hand, and the signal sounded with a low horn blast. That meant the trial had begun, and Vesha did not wait. She moved fast, like a wave of silver fire, and threw her right fist straight at Cade's chest with all her strength behind it, expecting the hit to send him flying, or at least knock him to the floor in shame. But her fist did not sink into soft skin, or break ribs as she had imagined. Instead, it hit something that felt like a wall of metal, like cold stone wrapped in flesh, and the shock of it ran up her arm so fast, she cried out without meaning to, and stumbled back with wide eyes. Her fingers hurt more than any training fight she ever had. Her wrist felt strange, and there was a sharp pain near her thumb that made her wonder if something had cracked inside. The crowd went silent for a second. Then gasps and confused voices filled the air as they all leaned forward, trying to understand what just happened. Because Cade had not moved at all, he had not flinched or raised a hand, he just stood there looking at her, with the same calm eyes as before. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice low and clear, but without any pride or anger, and he turned around and began walking toward the exit, like it was just another boring day. In a boring place. Vesha stood frozen, her hand still shaking, her pride burning more than the pain in her arm, and the other fighters, who had laughed before, were now whispering to each other, their eyes following the human with new looks, not of pity but of fear she had never seen. Someone stand still like that and take a full hit from a warrior, born and trained in the war worlds, and she had never felt her own strength break against something so solid, so calm, so real. Cade disappeared through the gate, and the crowd began to roar again, but this time it was not for her, it was not her name they shouted, it was his, and she clenched her jaw, feeling something strange in her chest. Not hate, not just anger, but something sharp and silent, like doubt. Later in the med-chamber, the healer wrapped her wrist and asked how it happened. She lied and said she fell, but the healer just smiled and said, "Next time do not punch steel walls. They do not move for any owner." Vesha said nothing, but her thoughts raced as she sat alone, thinking of that moment, the sound, the feeling, the way he stood like a mountain wrapped in human skin, and she wanted to know how and why. She watched a replay of the match over and over on the screen, zooming in, trying to see if he used some hidden shield or body tech, but there was nothing, no glow, no shield, no trick. It was just him. That night she sat by the edge of the barracks roof, looking up at the stars, wondering who Cade really was, and how a human could take her strongest punch without even blinking. And far below in the shadows, someone else was watching, to a silent figure who had seen what happened, and was sending a message to someone far away, message that said the human is active, and he is stronger than before. Somewhere deep in the war, moons. A cold voice smiled in the dark and whispered, "Then we begin again." The training dome buzzed with quiet shock as whispers echoed through its stone walls, and the memory of the punch still burned in Vesha's hand, and she flexed her fingers slowly, trying not to wince, as she walked past the others who had seen it, and they stepped back, not because they feared her, but because they now looked at her with questions in their eyes. Some smiled in secret amusement, while others looked at the human with careful glances, and Cade stood alone beside the resting platform, his eyes closed as if he was sleeping, while standing, and Vesha had never seen someone like him, someone so plain yet so unshakable. She walked past him on purpose, hoping he would say something, but he did not even glance her way, and his stillness felt heavier than any blade she had lifted, and her pride wanted to demand an answer, but her curiosity pulled at her harder. Later that day she followed him through the outer halls of the training grounds. Not close enough to be seen, but close enough to observe, and he moved with ease through the alien-built corridors, nodding politely to those who passed, but never stopping, and never showing emotion. He entered a quiet chamber under the old barracks, where few ever went, and she watched through the gap in the wall as he began lifting. Strange heavy blocks carved from stone and metal, and his muscles moved under his shirt, like coils of iron pulled by ancient force, and he made no sound, no grunt, no cry, just silent motion, over and over like a living machine's passed, and he continued without food, without water, and only paused once to write something in a small worn notebook filled with drawings of strange human symbols, and Vesha leaned closer, trying to understand what drove him, what made him so different from the other humans who always joked, or cried, or feared the Next morning, a high alert sounded across the dome, and all elite warriors were summoned to the center council chamber, where the lead captains stood in full armor, and behind them hovered a projection of a wild forest world. Spinning slow in space, you, the captain said, pointing to Cade and Vesha. You are being sent to trial. Planet 12, no weapons, no support, no guides, just survival. Vesha stepped forward at once, ready to accept, but Cade simply asked how long, and the captain answered 3 cycles, and Vesha blinked in surprise. Because 3 cycles meant 3 nights in the forest, where beasts roamed, and the planet never slept. The shuttle left within the hour, and Cade sat silently near the back, while Vesha glanced at him from the side, pretending not to stare, and she wondered if he would speak if she asked, but her pride stayed silent, and her thoughts louder. As they landed, the doors opened to green mist, thick like soup, and trees taller than towers, and the scent of wild earth filled their lungs, and Vesha felt her heart rise with the thrill of it. Because here there were no crowds, no rules, no shame, only fight or fall. Cade stepped out first and looked up at the twin suns, and then at the shifting shadows in the woods, and he nodded once, as if the land had greeted him, and he understood its rules, and that made Vesha uneasy, because she had been trained in jungle warfare, and yet he moved like he belonged. They walked together for hours through thick roots and strange sounds, and Vesha kept expecting him to ask for help, or show fear, but he did neither, and his quiet made the forest seem louder. Suddenly the ground shook, and a creature burst from the bushes fast as lightning, and twice her size, and Vesha jumped back, raising her fists, ready to strike, but her foot slipped on a moss-covered stone, and her balance broke, and her heart raced as the beast roared. But before she hit the ground, Cade moved faster than thought, and his hand grabbed the beast by the neck, his feet sliding with force, and he twisted the beast's head and slammed it into the earth with a crash that shook the birds from the trees. The beast groaned once, then lay still, and Cade let go slowly, breathing steady, and then turned to her and asked, "Are you hurt?" And Vesha could not speak at first, because she had never seen such power used so calmly. She stood slowly, brushing off her arm, and nodded no, and Cade simply turned and kept walking, like nothing had happened, and Vesha followed in silence, her mind full of questions and her heart beating strange. That night, they built a small shelter near a river, and Cade set stones in a circle, while she gathered dry leaves and wood, and she noticed how his hands worked with skill, not just strength, and how he never rushed anything but moved with perfect timing. As the fire grew warm, she sat beside him, and for the first time asked, "What kind of training do you have?" And he looked into the flames and said, "Pay nothing else, just pay none." Then he closed his eyes and leaned back on the stone and left her alone, with the fire and the wind and the whispering thoughts that this human was far more than she ever expected. The sun rose like a fireball behind the thick canopy, as strange birds screamed through the mist, and the trial world breathed its wild breath across the valley, and Cade stood by the river washing blood from his arm without a word, while Vesha crouched nearby, sharpening a branch into a spear, using a stone that sparked with each drag. She watched him with quiet eyes, now not mocking, not doubting, but studying, trying to understand how a creature of soft appearance could break monsters with bare hands, and never looked tired, and the memory of his voice, the word pain, echoed again and again, like a distant drum beat in her mind. They moved through the forest in silence, stepping over roots and crawling under thorned vines, as strange glowing insects buzzed in clouds above them, and once Cade reached out and pulled Vesha back before she stepped on a flat yellow moss that looked harmless, but hissed when touched and released a thick gas that burnt her throat. Even from a distance she coughed, and looked at him, and he said nothing, but kept walking, and she followed now, knowing he noticed everything. Every sound, every scent, every wrong color in the leaves, and it made her realize something. Else Cade was not reacting to danger, he was living inside it as if it were his true home, and she was the guest who had only read about it in training scrolls. By midday they reached a cliff that overlooked a sunken valley filled with crystal spires that pulsed with green light, and Cade crouched near the edge, scanning the land, while Vesha checked the skies for patrol birds, but saw none below them. The land looked peaceful, but Vesha knew it was never true on this world, and Cade pointed to the far side, where a stream cut through the rocks and vanished into a cave, and he said, "Shelter." and she nodded, and they began to climb down, slowly, careful of loose stones, and the cave mouth opened like a silent scream against the dark slope, and the walls inside shimmered with veins of glowing red crystal that pulsed with slow heat, like the breath of some great beast. And Cade stepped inside first with one hand on the wall, and eyes scanning every inch as if expecting the stones to strike, and Vesha followed behind, watching the way his body moved like water over stone. The warmth of the cave wrapped around them, and soon sweat began to form on their backs and arms, and Vesha pulled off her outer vest, while Cade sat on a flat rock and placed his bag beside him, and she could feel her heart beat slow after the climb, and after the long walk through the thick jungle. She sat down across from him, resting her spear, and staring at the fire crystals that gave the cave its glow, and then she asked him the question that had sat in her chest like a thorn since the moment her hand broke on his body. "What kind of training did you have back on Earth?" Cade looked at her, and for a moment said nothing, and then he reached into his bag, and pulled out a small round object that looked like a carved piece of wood with strange marks burned into it, and he placed it between them on the rock, and began to speak. "I was born in the ash sector of Earth, where the wind carries dust more than air, and the soil grows rust more than crops. And my home was a place where no one saved anyone, and you either got strong, or you died before your 10th year." He told her about the Iron Barracks, a place where unwanted children were thrown like trash and shaped into weapons by cruel hands and broken machines, and how each day began with pain and ended with silence, and how the weak were not punished, but simply forgotten and buried without names. He said that he trained not with tech or drugs, but with stones and metal and weight and endless running, and that he fought every week with other boys and girls who had nothing to lose and everything to prove, and how the trainers never cared who won, only who stood up again after falling. Vesha listened without blinking, and she felt the fire crystal's heat, but also the heat in his words, and the weight of them pressed against her like the pressure of deep water, and she saw something in his face that was not pride or anger, but something more ancient, something carved in silence. She asked him if he ever left that place, and he nodded and said yes. When he turned 17, he walked out because no one stopped him, and the doors were never locked, and the true cage was not iron, but fear, and he said he did not look back. The cave grew quiet for a while, and only the soft humming of the crystals filled the space, and Cade leaned against the rock wall and closed his eyes, while Vesha stared at his hands, wondering how many bones they had broken, how many walls they had pushed through, and how many times they had bled in secret. Then a strange light flickered across the wall, and Cade opened his eyes and whispered, "Not good," and Vesha followed his gaze, and saw tiny flying insects drifting in from the tunnel, their wings glowing blue, and their eyes bright like stars, and she knew at once they were firebugs drawn to heat, and sent and known to swarm with burning. Cade stood and grabbed a bundle of moss and rubbed it over his skin, then threw the rest into the stream near the cave mouth, and the bugs followed the scent and vanished into the mist, and Vesha copied his movements, her heart racing at the thought of what would have happened if she had been alone. When the danger passed, she looked at him and said, "You saved me again," and he shrugged and said, "Just part of the trial." But deep inside she knew this was not just a test, this was survival, and Cade moved through it like he belonged, and she began to understand that strength was not always loud and not always seen, and sometimes it looked like quiet hands, steady breath, and a back that never bent. She watched him sit again, and this time she sat closer and asked him to show her the symbols in his notebook, and he handed it over without a word, and she flipped through pages of drawings and strange writings and maps of places that looked like broken cities and endless roads. Each Mark told a story not with words but with lines and shapes and scars, and she realized this was how he spoke when no one listened, and how he remembered when no one cared, and it made her chest ache in a way she had never felt. She looked at him and said, "Maybe the strongest warriors are the ones who already survived a war before the battle ever began," and Cade smiled a little and nodded once. And outside the cave, the jungle watched and listened as two enemies sat by the fire, and something changed between them, something unspoken, something like trust waiting to grow. The jungle was still as night fell across the canopy, and shadows stretched long over the thick roots and the broken stones, and Cade stood near the edge of the cave, with his arms crossed and his eyes focused on the trees that swayed without wind. And Vesha sat beside the fire, tracing her fingers over the marks in his notebook, trying to make sense of the shapes he had drawn. They had grown quiet since the firebugs came and went, and neither spoke of what almost happened, and instead they shared silence like warriors who knew words were useless in places where death watched with patient eyes. And Vesha felt something deep in her bones, that the trial had shifted and the real danger had not shown itself. Yet suddenly a sound came from The darkness not loud but sharp and short, like a twig breaking under a foot, and Cade moved before she even registered the noise, his hand pulling her behind the stone wall, and his body low to the ground, and his breath steady and slow. He whispered one word, Apex, and her heart jumped because she knew what it meant, and every trial zone had one a beast, stronger, smarter, and deadlier than the rest, and only a few teams ever saw it, and even fewer lived to tell about it. The creature stepped into the moonlight, slow and silent, with eyes that burned like ice, and fur that shimmered like black oil, and it stood taller than both of them, with claws that dragged across the stone, leaving lines deep enough to break bone, and its head turned toward the cave like it had already chosen its Pravesha, reached for her spear, but Cade shook his head and pointed to the slope above the cave, and she understood they would not fight it here, not yet, not in the open, where it held the ground and the night, and the advantage. They moved together without sound, climbing the slope and circling the ridge, and Cade studied every step, every branch, every leaf, like he had walked this land before, and she followed close, feeling the weight of fear pressing down on her chest, but also the strange comfort of his presence, leading them. They reached a hollow high above the cave, where thick vines hung from twisted trees, and a narrow path led down into a gorge filled with stones and broken logs, and Cade began building something, using the terrain like a craftsman shaping a trap with roots and gravity, and Flameshow watched and helped, as he placed stones in layers and tied vines between branches and soaked dry moss in oil from his kit, and he explained, in short, clear words, how the beast would chase, and where it would step, and where the fire would catch, and how they would make it foul. She nodded and worked with him, and her hands moved fast and sure, and her breath came easier with each task, because it felt like they were no longer prey. They were hunters, writing the end of something older and crueler than them. Night deepened, and stars blinked through the leaves, and the Apex prowled near their old camp, sniffing the air and growling low, and Cade dropped a piece of blood-stained cloth down the path to draw it in, and they waited in silence. Ground trembled as the beast approached, its steps heavy and slow, and filled with ancient hunger, and it followed the scent like a shadow made of teeth and muscle, and when it reached the first trigger, Cade pulled the line, and the fire burst from the moss with a roar. The creature screamed and thrashed, but kept coming, and Vesha threw her spear, with perfect aim, striking its shoulder and making it stumble, and Cade charged down the path, meeting it head-on with nothing but a sharp branch, and his own body. He leaped over the broken logs, and slammed the branch into its neck, twisting with all his strength, and the beast roared again, and clawed at him, but he held firm, and Vesha joined the fight with a second spear, striking from the side together. They drove the creature into the trap's final circle, where the stones collapsed and the vines snapped, and it fell into the pit with a crash that shook the trees, and its body writhed once, then lay still. They stood above it, breathing hard and covered in dirt and sweat and blood, and Vesha looked at Cade with new eyes, not of confusion or challenge, but of something stronger, something that burned with pride and respect. "You should have let me help from the start," she said, and he smiled and replied, "I needed to see if you would follow or run in." "Now you know," she said, and he nodded. They returned to the cave as dawn began to touch the sky, and sat by the fire once more, and Vesha looked at her own hands, and thought of how they once broke against his body, but now had fought beside him, and held their ground somewhere far above the planet. A silent ship watched from orbit and recorded every moment, and voices whispered in cold rooms about the human who hunted the Apex without fear. The sky turned pale gold as the twin suns rose behind the jagged cliffs, and the jungle world began to stir again with distant roars and soft chirps that echoed across the valley, and Vesha stood at the edge of the stream, washing dried blood from her arms, while Cade crouched beside a fallen tree, carving a mark into its bark with a sharp rock, and neither of them spoke. For a long time their bodies ached, and their clothes were torn and dirty. And yet there was something calm in the air, like the weight of the night had lifted, and left only silence and memory behind. And when Cade looked up from his carving, his eyes met Vesha's, and he gave a short nod of quiet approval, and she returned it, without words. They had survived the worst the trial planet had to offer, and not by luck or mercy, but by planning, by strength, by trusting one another without speaking it out loud. And deep inside, Vessia knew that something inside her had changed, and the same feeling was in Cade's quiet gaze, as if he had seen a new side of her, and accepted it without question. Before they could move further, a sudden beam of blue light struck the ground near their feet, and both of them jumped back, their weapons raised in an instant. But no enemy appeared, and instead a low hum filled the air, and a tall figure stepped out of a shimmer in space, cloaked in white armor and glowing bands of light. Behind the figure floated 3 drones each, one marked with the seal of the Galactic Trial Council, and Cade lowered his weapon slowly as the figure lifted one hand, and said the words, "The trial is over, you have passed." Vesha looked at the figure, confused, and asked, "What do you mean? The trial ends in one more cycle." And the figure replied, "This was not just a survival test. This was a selection. A hidden council chamber appeared behind them as the shimmer widened and opened into a wide metal hall filled with alien generals, warriors, and scholars from different worlds, each one seated in silence and watching them from elevated platforms. And in the center, a table with weapons, scrolls, and a glowing crystal that hovered mid-earth. Figure led Cade and Vesha inside and told them to stand before the council, and they obeyed with heads high and backs straight. And the lead general, a scaled creature with 6 eyes and golden robes, leaned forward and spoke. "You were chosen for this trial not to see if you could survive, but to see if you could lead, if you could rise, if you could awaken something forgotten and lost among the stars. And you have." Cade looked unimpressed and asked, "Then what happens now?" And the general smiled and said, "Now, we offer you purpose." Vesha was offered the rank of Star Commander with her own ship and crew, and full access to war council strategies and elite warrior networks. And Cade was offered the title of Guardian, first a role meant for those who protect the heart of the fleet at any cost. But Cade stepped forward and said, "I am not interested in titles or medals. I did not come here to join your games, I came to protect people." The council whispered among themselves, and one elder slammed his fist on the table and growled, "Then you will protect our empire, or you will be cast out and forgotten." And Vesha stepped between them, her voice sharp and clear, and said, "If you cast him out, you cast me too, because I will not serve beside anyone who does not respect what true strength looks like." Silence fell, and then another voice spoke from the shadows behind the council table. A soft voice like wind over ice, and a tall woman with silver hair and dark robes stepped forward, her eyes glowing with old knowledge. She said, "The human does not want power, but power seeks him, and we will not force him to wear chains, not when he has already broken his own." And she turned to Cade and said, "Then protect only what you choose to protect, and let the rest find their own path." The council agreed after long debate, and Vesha and Cade were given passage back to the fleet. But not as tools, not as pets, but as something new, something they could not define, but could not ignore. As they walked through the corridor leading to the ship that would take them off the trial planet, Vesha looked at Cade and said, "You know you could have had command." And Cade smiled and said, "I already have what I need." And she raised an eyebrow and asked, "What's that?" And he answered, "Someone who finally sees me." Far above, in the observation deck, another screen blinked and another shadowed figure leaned forward, watching the recordings of the human and the warrior, and whispered to no one in particular, "He is not just strong, he is something else." The stars stretched endless across the void as the ship moved quietly through the dark sea of space and inside the silent halls. Cade stood near a window watching the stars blink like old memories, and his mind wandered to the jungle world they had left behind, and to the moment the apex had fallen, and to the words spoken in fire and blood and breath behind him. The door opened with a soft hiss, and Vesha stepped in wearing a new uniform lined with silver threads and deep violet symbols of rank and honor, though she carried herself with the same steady weight as before. And her eyes met his in the reflection of the glass, and she said nothing for a moment before stepping beside him. "I thought you would take the chamber they gave you," she said, and Cade shrugged and replied, "The stars are enough," and she nodded, understanding more in his silence than in his words, and they stood there for a while, not as commander and protector, but simply as to who had seen something real together. Voice crackled through the cum walls, warning of a breach near the lower cargo bay, and both turned without speaking, moving through the corridors like a single thought. And when they reached the bay, they found 3 bodies already on the ground, and a figure standing over them in black armor with a curved blade dripping violet liquid. The figure turned, and its helmet split open, revealing a face twisted by rage and scars, and Vesha recognized it at once as one of the warriors who had once challenged her during her rise and been exiled after dishonor, and now returned with vengeance. "In his bones you brought shame to our name," he growled, "and you protect a human like he is more than dirt." And Vesha stepped forward, her voice like thunder, and said, "He is more than you ever were," and her fists rose ready to strike. The assassin moved fast, but Cade moved faster, stepping into the strike and catching the blade with his bare hand, blood dripping down his wrist, and yet his grip never loosened, and his eyes never blinked, and he twisted the weapon from the attacker's hand and drove a punch into his chest that sent the figure flying across the room. More shadows dropped from the ceiling blades, drawn and eyes glowing with hate, and Vesha fought beside Cade, moving in perfect rhythm, her body a storm of motion and purpose, and together they brought down the last of them, with breath heavy and heart steady. And when it was over, Cade looked at his bleeding hand, and Vesha stepped closer, taking it gently in hers. She wrapped it with a strip torn from her sleeve, and whispered, "I told you I would help this time." And Cade looked at her with quiet eyes and said, "I know." The captain of the ship arrived moments later, with guards, and stared at the bodies, and then at Cade and Vesha, and asked what happened here, and Cade answered simply, "We were tested again." Later, in the quiet of the recovery wing, Vesha sat beside Cade as the medpod sealed the wound on his hand, and she spoke of the day she first mocked him in the arena, and how she had thought strength was only seen in the body, in the power of fists and scars, and how wrong she had been. She held up her hand, the same one that had broken against his chest, and she said, "This hand once struck you with pride, now it stands beside you with something more." And Cade smiled and replied, "And that is the strongest strike of all." They left the medbay together, walking through the halls now filled with silence and respect, and eyes that once doubted now nodded in quiet understanding. And far above the ship, in the depths of space, a hidden station received the final report. The human has bonded, the warrior has chosen the path, is confirmed. In a room filled with silence, the council of ancient watchers closed the file, and one among them spoke for the first time in years, and said, "The galaxy does not know it yet, but something has changed, and it started with a laugh, a punch, and a human who did not break, and far below the stars." In the heart of the ship, Vesha leaned her head gently against Cade's shoulder, and whispered, "I no longer care what others think, because I have seen your strength, and now I trust it with my life." Cade looked at her, and nodded, and together they walked forward into the unknown, where new trials waited, not with fear but with the calm certainty that whatever came next, they would face it as one.